When people talk about interoperability, the conversation usually focuses around data elements and exchange standards, things like HL7, FHIR, mapping fields, or transformation rules. But before any two systems can exchange data, there's a more fundamental problem that needs to be looked at. How do we know that both systems are talking about the same patient? If you're new here, my name is Dre. I'm a health IT consultant, and my goal here is to help people in all areas of health IT understand the broader picture so that we can have better conversations between clinical and technical teams. Today, we're going to talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and that's the Enterprise Master Patient Index, or EMPI. And if you touch interoperability, registration data, or patient records in any way, it matters more than you might think it does. When it comes to interoperability, discussions tend to lean a little bit more towards the technical mechanics. Things like standardizing and mapping data elements, determining what's going to be sent outbound and in what format, figuring out whether there needs to be any sort of transformation in the engine or if it's direct between point A and point B, and then mapping everything in the receiving side so that you make sure that the data that is being sent is being received and has the right context and is landing in the right spot. Those are all very important discussions. But before any of that matters, both the sending and the receiving system need a reliable way to figure out who the subject is. Because data that's attached to the wrong patient is worse than no data at all. Within a single application or even within a single facility, patient matching for messages usually isn't that difficult. There's typically an MRN or a medical record number that's assigned, and sending and receiving can both match on that number. So as long as everything is happening in the same environment, things tend to be quite contained and quite clean. Where it starts to get a little more complicated is when you have a system that doesn't have the ability to rely on MRN, or if you're trying to exchange data between another facility's systems, between different EHRs, for example, or between external organizations, where their unique identifier is going to be different than the one that you have in place at the facility or the hospital that you work at. So let's say you have a patient that receives care at 3 different facilities, and each of the facilities has its own MRN. If you want to take a look at that patient's longitudinal care journey as part of a broader organization, say an organization that works multi-state or one that covers an entire province, you need to make sure that when data is exchanged between systems, that there's a reliable way for each system to know which record something should be attached to. Your first instinct might be to use a national identifier, but what do you do if a patient doesn't have one, doesn't know it, or it wasn't captured when they were registered? You still need a reliable way to determine identity if you're going to be connecting information between different systems. So that's where an Enterprise Master Patient Index, or EMPI, comes in. Think of the EMPI as the patient identity layer that sits underneath interoperability. Its job is not to store patient records. Its job is to help determine which records belong to the same individual across multiple systems. An EMPI typically maintains a unique enterprise identifier for each patient, and then it creates relationships with that number to all the other identifying data that exists within the other systems. So System A might know the patient by one identifier, but System B might know them by a completely different one. And the EMPI is going to help establish that the records belong to the same individual. So to do that, it relies on something called patient matching. Matching is the process of comparing patient information across different records in the system to see if that individual already exists in the enterprise. That comparison might use things such as name, address, date of birth, phone number, or different identifiers. And its goal is really to answer one simple question. Is this a new patient or somebody that we already know about? And sometimes that answer isn't always clear. Maybe a name was entered differently. Maybe the phone number was mistyped. Or maybe a patient registered at 2 different facilities, and now there's 2 different records that seem to belong to the same person. So when that happens, the EMPI is also going to help detect potential duplicates so that they can be reviewed and managed appropriately. Once a match is confirmed, the EMPI assigns or maintains a unique enterprise identifier that represents the patient across all connected systems. Individual applications can keep using their local identifiers or the MRN, but behind the scenes, you've got the EMPI that has everything connected together to identify that it's the same unique individual. And from there, you can allow information to flow between the systems and land in the right spot. So the final piece to the EMPI is identity management. So identity is not something that is static in the sense that once it's created, it never changes. And you have to make sure that everything that is maintained within the EMPI is being mindful of the fact that things may change over time. So people might change their names, they might get married, they might move addresses, get a new phone number, new systems might come online and they'd have an additional identifier that came from there, all those sorts of things. So to help this make a little bit more sense, let's look at an analogy. So in the United States, there's something called the National Provider Identifier, or NPI. And this is where healthcare providers are given a unique number at the national level to identify who they are in the healthcare system. So it doesn't matter what hospital they're working at, what facility they're with, what organization they may work for, or how many clinics they may have. They all have a unique NPI number that identifies exactly who they are. EMPI is something similar in concept, but it's for patients. So of course, they aren't assigned a national number that uniquely identifies them across every healthcare facility that they may interact with. In fact, EMPIs can exist within an organization, they can exist within a group of partner organizations, and a patient may be connected to in some way multiple EMPIs depending on where they're receiving care. It is meant to just cohesively connect a group of systems together that are going to exchange information with each other in a way that they can clearly identify who the patient is in all the systems that are in that enterprise. So as you can imagine, patient matching can get kind of complicated depending on how big the enterprise is that the EMPI is looking after. So if you're involved in any kind of interoperability discussions, one of the very first questions that you'll want to ask is, how does the receiving system know who the patient is? What are they using to determine that? Is it using an MRN? Is it using a different unique identifier? Or is it relying on an EMPI to do some sort of patient matching between the systems? If the answer is EMPI, that's great. But you want to go a little bit deeper to learn what specific data elements it's going to use to perform that matching function so that you can ensure that they're accurately captured or reviewed as part of the workflow. You also want to understand what happens if it can't make a competent match. Is it going to file to a close match candidate? Is it going to reject the message entirely? Maybe it's going to send it off to a queue for someone in HIM to manually review and perform that linkage if it's appropriate. Or, and this is one that might make you a little bit leery, is it going to create an on-the-fly patient or a duplicate patient in the system so that now you have two separate patients that are actually really the same person? So all of these things matter for how you're maintaining identity long-term and for the clinical data that's going to end up on the patient's chart that people are going to be making decisions off of. So it's important to understand whether the EMPI is in place and being used and sort of what it does so that all of the workflows and discussions around it can happen appropriately. They're incredibly powerful at being able to put that longitudinal record for a patient together, which is very, very important and helpful for all clinicians. But it's important to understand sort of where the little nuances are. And as an analyst or as an informaticist or even as an interface team member, it's important to see sort of how that fits into everything. And a lot of people just default to the fact that interoperability belongs with the interface team, and by extension, the EMPI really only matters to them. But it's tied to successful and accurate patient identity, so it's so much more than that. Patient identity quality starts with registration. It depends on accurate demographic information being captured and recorded in the appropriate place. It relies on HIM teams to manage duplicates and make sure you've got data integrity. It relies on operational leaders, on informatics teams, and on application and interface analysts to design workflows and systems that are going to support accurate matching. And it requires governance processes by groups that are going to make sure that everyone is working towards the same standards. So in other words, patient identity isn't owned by a single team, and making sure that an EMPI is successful isn't owned by a single team either. At the end of the day, interoperability is not just about moving data from one system to the other. It's about making sure that the right information reaches the right place about the right patient at the right time. So the next time you find yourself in an interoperability discussion, just take a moment to think beyond the message structure, the mapping, and the interface design. And think about how System A and System B are going to know that you're talking about the same patient. That's all I have for today. I hope it was helpful and you learned a little bit more about the identity layer that sits underneath interoperability. As always, if you like the kind of content I'm putting out there, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. I will see you again next time.